This is kind of our, tradition of having a TOC panel where, they'll introduce themselves, I'll ask some questions, and then we'll kind of open it up to the audience to ask questions and what projects they want to throw their way and so on. So for people that aren't familiar with how CNCF is structured, we essentially have this body called the Technical Operating Committee, or TOC. They kind of act as the main, core set of people that decide the overall technical vision and strategy for the organization, and most importantly, decide which projects are in, out, and so on. So there are a total of 9 people currently, which most of them are here. We are going to be adding 2 more TOC members starting early next year, so the TOC will be comprised of 11 individuals, so there'll be an election that happens in February next year to do that. But before we kind of dive into things, how about everyone goes and introduces themselves? Let's go start with
Hello,
Matt.
check. I am Matt Klein. I'm a software engineer from Lyft.
Also Mr.
Envoy.
Hi, I'm Brian Grant. I work at Google on Kubernetes and Google Kubernetes Engine.
Hey, I'm Michelle from Microsoft. I work on Helm.
Hi, I'm Liz Rice. I work for Aqua Security and run open source engineering there. And I'm chair of this illustrious body.
I am Jeff Brewer. I'm the chief architect of the QuickBooks group at Intuit.
Hi, I'm Alexis Richardson. I'm the CEO of Weaveworks and co-founder.
Hi, I'm Joe Beda. I'm a principal engineer at VMware doing a lot of cloud native things.
Perfect. So the first thing I kind of wanted to bring up for folks is there's been a lot of kind of change, I think, the last 6 to 12 months in terms of how the TOC is starting to operate. They've gone through this exercise of realizing that it's impossible to scale and have domain expertise in every specific area. So we've created this notion of things called CNCF SIGs, which some of these are fully operational up there. Things like security, the security SIG, storage SIG are all kind of... Yeah, SIG security are all kind of fairly operational and working, and the whole idea here is to have the SIGs act as kind of filter and focus area to kind of review projects, assess projects, and so on before they're kind of bubbled up to the TOC. Do you have any comments on kind of how that's been working so far and other kind of old motivations of how that came about?
Yeah, I think the scaling point is really important about the SIGs. I think it's a mechanism that lets us kind of lean on expertise around the broader community, lean on some time from around the broader community, and we also see it as a potential pathway for people who, maybe want to get more involved and, they have the opportunity to get involved in a SIG where maybe they have domain expertise, and that can be like a pathway to other leadership roles in the CNCF.
Could you raise your hand if you've been to a TOC meeting before? Okay, cool. And can you raise your hand if you've been involved in a CNCF SIG yet? Okay. And could you raise your hand if you came here so you could get more information on how to get involved in a CNCF SIG? Okay. I just wanted to do a poll. You can have it back.
You like polls?
Yeah, I really love polls.
Yeah.
Data.
Yeah, it's like, how many people came here to potentially propose a project to the CNCF? Oh, no, we got, no, see?
Proposal in progress.
Yeah, there.
Argo guy.
Yeah, there we go. So, the kind of goal of this is like, I'll ask a couple of questions to the folks, but we kind of really want to make this interactive and kind of take questions from the audience. But, something that I get approached by folks quite a bit of, why isn't, X in CNCF, or, when do you stop, or when are we done? So my question to kind of the TOC here is, we've grown a lot over the last few years. There's 40 plus projects now in all different areas. We've kind of even expanded scope as an organization. What do you think is kind of missing from kind of our overall landscape of projects currently? Like what are some missing pieces you think that belong or should be in CNCF that are not? And then I will ask that question to the audience.
Sure, I can start. I think the big area that I'm missing right now is operational tooling. So I think we have a lot of low-level systems like databases and networking and container orchestrators and things like that. But I think most companies are struggling with things like how do they list the things that they have? How do they terminate things? How do they know who did what? So just generally, how do we actually do DevOps? I think that's missing.
We have a number of building blocks for building out a platform for certain types of workloads on Kubernetes or other cloud-native approaches, but we're seeing it used in Kubernetes in particular used in more and more different scenarios for more and more different workloads. We do have KubeEdge for edge deployments, but I think there are still a lot more different types of workloads, for example, batch, where we could have more projects in those areas.
I think something we're missing is like patterns, like published, well-defined patterns. And so that's something I'm really excited about to see from the SIGs. Particularly app delivery is really focused on defining terminology and then gathering use cases and writing these white papers around patterns related to DevOps. So I think before we kind of go into we need this project, we need that project, I'm really excited to kind of take a step back and really have these experts in different areas tell us these are the things we're seeing, these are the patterns we're seeing, and then we can kind of fill in the gaps there.
I think actually, yeah, building on that, a lot of what we're missing is kind of almost like documentation or explaining to end users, potential adopters, how do you plug all these things together? We were having a discussion earlier on about how we don't necessarily want to always provide the glue between all these different things, and we don't want to provide an opinionated stack, but we do want to have a better way of explaining to people who haven't yet started adopting cloud native, how does this help? How do you put it together? What do you need? Where do you start?
I don't know if everyone needs to answer
Just if you want to go for it, go for it. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the interesting observations is I think that we're now starting to talk about things that are on the edges more, and that the core ecosystem is getting fairly mature, right? I mean, there are services meshes now, there are deployment tools, there are proxies, there's security. I mean, it's getting to that point where it's fairly mature. So I think the key is where are the feature gaps in the existing projects, and can we encourage maintainers to find existing projects to go and contribute to expanding the feature set of those.
I'd like to see more input from end users, big non-traditional technology firms. I see Intuit sitting in front just here as an example. To say what is important to them and behind.
Yeah.
I'm trapped.
You're surrounded.
Help. To say what is important to them. So for example, we have financial services companies in this ecosystem. I would love to hear from them what are the most important things impacting their business in Cloud Native, and what can we do in the Cloud Native Foundation that the foundation can help with that makes them happier or feel that they're adopting Cloud Native more quickly or more safely perhaps. So for example, we know they are highly regulated organizations. What is the impact of that, and what can we do in technology or documentation or practices to make their lives easier? Not everybody has to answer. Thanks, Joe. We left our app delivery.
All right. So, to kind of flip this, to the audience, is there something that you think is missing, or you may not understand, that you kind of want to ask this group of folks?
Don't be shy.
Runtime security.
So what? Okay, what's
Yeah, software supply chain is a really good, and runtime security. It's really good.
Well, I'm sorry.
so
Oh,
Dependency.
great one.
I'm going to
Great.
repeat the
Yeah.
comment. Dependency management and security of those was the comment, and that's a great one. One of the things that I think we were talking about earlier today is we need a way to start actually breaking down and categorizing the projects in a useful way so that we can identify some of these gaps, the places where we want to be able to solicit new projects, solicit folks to start solving some things that we think are super critical. And so I think, these are great examples. I think we also, need to have a way to put that stuff in context. And so I think that's one of the things that we're missing a little bit. And I know that there's been some efforts started on this that we're talking about continuing. So I think those are some great suggestions.
I think more on rather than new projects, on the governance side, actually looking at you have all of these, software systems that are open source, and then there's obviously usually a company or a set of companies that are behind them, but essentially having a way to regulate at which point when something is part of CNCF, like a CNCF project, what level of integration should there be for that project within that ecosystem? I guess you have fancy GUIs and orchestration that lives on top of some core component, and that's generally how it goes. And then you start seeing a shift of functionality into the enterprise version or the commercial version of that thing, and having some way to actually regulate to say actually no, you need to start building that as part of the open source ecosystem, rather than having that functionality just drift into the enterprise and essentially drag people always towards the enterprise.
So I think I guess the question is, the way I look at it, and let me know if I'm restating this the wrong way. We want to make sure that the projects in the CNCF are independently usable. That it's not hey, this thing is only usable if you buy the commercial complement to it. And I think one of the things that we do, and I think we need to get better about communicating this, but we do have a rising set of expectations as projects move between sandbox and incubating and graduating. Some of that is a certain level of production use, activity, and we do a due diligence process along the way. And so one of the things I would be looking at when I'm doing due diligence on a project is how many production users are there, which is one of the things we look at. But if all those production users are through the lens of a single vendor, to me that would be a bad smell, and that would actually be a sign of a project that is probably not ready to actually sort of move forward.
To the level of there are very few projects that have an open source GUI that comes with the actual piece of software. I understand that that's a lot of development effort.
So
there's a very important thing here that, this is about open source technology, but around which a healthy ecosystem has to exist.
Sure.
So we, in the open source community, have these building blocks that are kind of fundamental, and we're trying to de-risk those. I don't think the job of this organization is to put all those vendors out of business.
No, I don't see that either, but I think that there has to be a way to control the balance between...
It's mostly back-end infrastructure. We're all terrible at GUIs.
So one small comment is that, we have the features in open source that companies pay people to write that software, right? So I feel much more strongly that we have to have the right governance in place so that projects, particularly projects that are, that we would consider graduated, that they're not blocking features that might actually be also implemented in those enterprise projects. So I really don't think it's going to work for us or any of us to say that projects should have a GUI or should do X, Y, or Z, because ultimately it's open source. But I think that we have to make sure that the projects can take those features if there are people that are actually willing to write them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the litmus test. So we don't end up in a thing that you have like an Nginx or Vault where people they actively block feature development. I think that's kind of what you're digging at.
Right.
Yeah.
To follow up on Alexis's point, it has actually been hard to continuously staff people working on a GUI for Kubernetes for example. Yeah, so that I can see how projects might have trouble attracting people to do that.
Two questions, and they're kind of related. The first one is, how do you handle industry pressures to get a project to graduate, or to make the determination of when it's ready versus when company announcements are scheduled and conferences are scheduled and things like that? And the correlate of that is, when there are what I would consider to be key features in an open source project, like let's say security, that the downstream vendors have implemented and are selling, but have not made it upstream, how do you balance that? And you see how these are related.
So can I answer this one? Okay, so great questions. On the first one, I like to say there are no surprises in open source. And so if somebody wants to have a big reveal at a keynote, it's not open source. I mean, we have these blog posts talking about the latest features in the Kubernetes release. There are no surprises there. It's like this stuff has been in the works for a long time. And so I think it's, from the point of view of the pressures of graduating and that type of thing, we go through a due diligence process. As part of that, we try and be fair about the criteria that we're looking for. We have a list of those criteria, and there's a certain amount of sort of judgment from the TOC backed up by the SIGs that really comes into play there. So that's, I think, I don't think we've hit a situation where there's been undue pressure to graduate to the point where it's turned, like, hit a breaking point. And I don't know, maybe you all have examples of that.
Yeah, no, I was pretty much going to say that kind of thing. And also, there obviously is a desire for projects to, they want to say, yeah, we graduated. They want to do it. We understand that, people want to be able to show progress at an event like this. That's completely reasonable. The reality is we have so much bandwidth. We've had quite a few votes, I would say, over the last 3 weeks.
KubeCon-driven development is totally a thing. Like,
But we do try very hard to stick with the rigor of the due diligence that has to happen. Yeah. But I think we all understand it would be, very welcome if we could just sort of accelerate a bit in the run-up to a...
Yeah. For people with projects, plan one KubeCon ahead, right? Because if we have 20 projects, submit proposals to advance 1 month before KubeCon, there's like zero chance that that's going to happen.
Okay, so now the second part of the question around security, this is actually, so we had breakfast with the chairs of SIG Security this morning, and this exact thing came up. And I think, we do have those list of expectations for projects as they advance along. I think we need to do a better job of organizing it and surfacing those expectations. And I think that there are going to be some horizontal expectations around projects around security that we're going to hold to them. Establishing exactly what those things are is I think something that we're going to work with the SIG around, tightening up and making more clear. But I think, we're all agreed that security has to be part of every project, and the more mature the project, the more rigor we're going to bring there.
I think you said it perfectly. Yeah.
All right, Dims, did you have a?
I have a follow-up question on that. I was trying to signal boost.
Oh, you
but I had a question too. So we have a huge amount of choices in terms of the projects if you just look at the landscape, and it's kind of overwhelming. If you start with Kubernetes, then add this thing on, add that thing on, and soon, you have no clue what you're doing. You're ending up curl bash, and you're pulling in manifests from everywhere. So what do people have to do? I mean, what do you expect? Do you expect people to have development teams that will actually set things up, get things working, harden it, and then use it in production? What would be the kind of the workflow that you would expect people to do?
Well, I want to address the complexity of the landscape part first. Brian and I talked about this morning. It seems like people are having a hard time figuring out how the pieces all fit together. And we don't necessarily want to be prescriptive about exactly what that vertical stack should look like, because we don't want to influence that necessarily, but we want to have solid building blocks, solid interoperable modular components that work with each other. Landscape is very complex right now, and we want to simplify that. That's an initiative that we talked about. Brian and I talked about crowdsourcing other people's maps that they've created. Other people will go to their companies and try to explain the cloud native landscape in their own way to make it make sense. And I think gathering that information and consolidating it and figuring out what makes sense for end users is something that we're definitely going to take on. Y'all seem really passionate. Go for it.
I was going to say, like, the analogy, and I just came up with this, so tell me if this doesn't make sense. The CNCF is kind of like a Home Depot. If you want a piece of furniture, you don't go to Home Depot, right? Now, you may go and they may have a class of, like, here's how you, build a table out of 2x4s, but it's not,
Go to IKEA instead.
What's that?
Go to IKEA instead.
Yeah, go to IKEA instead, or, pick your furniture store. So I think, one of the ways we like to talk about is that there's a difference between a project and a product. And the CNCF is fundamentally about projects. If you really want that curated experience, then you want a product, and that's really not what we are.
When we created the CNCF, it was very important to try and find a balance between different interests within the ecosystem so that it could be self-sustaining. And I think that, like it or not, creating this role for vendors and products and commerce and customer relationships is actually an important part of the ecosystem. And it does solve that particular problem. And there are clearly many vendors here who will help you with their opinions. If you want to have a more community-based solution, one avenue to explore is the SIGs, who I think should be creating more patterns, as Liz said, as we go forward, which could give people an alternative way of getting guidance.
One quick add to that is just on the end user community as well, is like learning from others, right? So that's another way of discovering these patterns, is just like, hey, if you're in part of that end user community, how did you guys do this, right? And that'll be a much better way of navigating that ecosystem, because you could see someone else that's done it that's like you.
I just want to add real quick before we hand it off to Chris. She's been waiting so patiently.
She's losing patience.
So solid building blocks, and then I'm excited again. Like the SIGs have all expressed that they're interested in writing white papers, and some of them have already done that and are starting. And so we have these building blocks. We hope to get patterns, these white papers, this educational material out, and then you can figure out how those, you can have examples of how these building blocks kind of fit in this pattern. Chris.
Okay, so I have a microphone, so y'all are going to listen to me, and I'm going to circle back and double click on Ava's point here from earlier. So in the mindset of security, right? And we saw this with infrastructure, with, like, for instance, spinning up a Kubernetes cluster, the work that we did in SIG cluster lifecycle. The first problem we solved was the initial fix, right? So security with a tool, getting it to graduation. We want to make sure it's secure on day one. But that is only a subset of the problem here. The more important piece to me is managing security over time. And I'll pick on Kubernetes here, because that's the one that I've been most involved with. We have open CVEs, we did the white paper on it, and has the TOC given any thought to how we go about managing security concerns as they arise over time as projects are in different states of the CNCF?
I guess the one thing that we do have that's concrete on that is as you get to graduation, you have to have like a security reporting process. I don't think we have anything particular leading up to that, and I don't think we have any particular. We don't make requirements of, I don't know how quickly they fix certain severity.
But depending on their, not graduated projects, but sandbox and incubation, we do review them once a year, right?
Yeah,
like
we have different expectations. So, like, for graduated projects, that you must have a security disclosure process, you must have gone through an audit, and so on. And that's basically it. Other than that, it's up for projects to ask, like, hey, if we're earlier and you want an audit, we're happy to see what we could do. But that's the only gate really that we have.
The other thing that we're trying to have is the assessments from SIG Security, which is I think one of the really valuable things that a SIG like that can offer is, a project that has nothing to do with security still has an impact on the security of the overall system. And having security folks take a look, they're very keen to sort of say this is not like a professional audit, but we'll just take a look and give some advice on what you could do in that project to improve the security and maybe, TLS by default, that kind of thing.
The other thing I forgot about is we do have this we force this best practices badging thing that is a project from the Linux Foundation. It's kind of like if you've read the checklist manifesto, it's like a checklist of good things that your project must have, and a security disclosure thing is one of those. So,
yeah, I would say that if we had a project that just was asleep at the wheel on fixing CVEs, or in some ways that almost becomes a failed project, right? Or a project that is clearly not healthy. And I think it's the job of the TOC then to figure out what do we do with projects that are not meeting their responsibilities, whether we archive that project, whether, and I think, to some degree, we're going to have to face those situations as we come at them. I think it's all very theoretical at this point, but, and I think so, there are extremes that may happen that we're going to have to deal with, but we haven't hit that yet.
My response there is, are you happy with what we are doing in Kubernetes? Do you think we are doing enough? If we are doing enough, can we use that as a template for the rest of the projects? And what do we need to tweak? That's the question there.
So I'll give the Chris Nova answer. This is, I speak for myself, not representing any entity here. But yeah, I think Kubernetes does a great job, and that's one of the reasons why hats off to Dems and everybody here, Brian especially, for the work that we're doing in upstream Kubernetes. But that's why I picked it, is because it's not perfect, and we're doing the best we can. And I think that it is something that as these projects start to mature, the CNCF is still really young, right? And Kubernetes was the first one to graduate, but now we're getting more and more. And as these projects in the graduated state start to mature, there's going to be these discussions of management over time, and I think security is going to be the first one that we're going to need to address. So yeah, maybe it does make sense to sort of take Kubernetes again as our poster child and start to model policy around that.
I think we need to do more DIMs.
Yeah. No, I mean, that security audit experience last year was, or I guess earlier this year, was so entertaining. We're doing it again next year, so good times.
The chap back there has been hand up
Who was
for a while.
first? Gentleman back?
Yeah.
Thanks. Just one quick question around CNCF project measurement of end users becoming contributors to the project that they use instead of becoming what I like to call project wallflowers. Any tracking of that as far as you see it's a boost in participation when companies actually become end users?
Sure. Actually, that was a topic we were just discussing over lunch. We're trying to figure out how we can help end users become successful contributors, remove blockers from contributing at their organizations, help them understand how to get started and be successful, and reward them and recognize them for doing so.
We have Cheryl, who's a part of the CNCF, and her whole job is to make the help the end user community, and I think she's been doing a really great job. I got to be on a panel where there's maintainers, and they're talking to end users and telling them how they can contribute and what they could do to be involved. And so I think a metric would be really great, and I think we could take that feedback back. We've been talking about that quite a bit.
It's probably relatively easy to pull out if we can, from DevStats. We just need to figure out which companies are which.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just to explain overall. So I'm, for those who don't know, inside the TOC, I'm the end user elected representative on the TOC, and that's part of my job is recognizing those things, but also that there is an end user award that's given out at the Europe conferences that does recognize that, and my own company, Intuit, won that last year, but in part, I think, because we did recognize the fact that we're also contributing back to projects, and that was the discussion at lunch, is we just have to figure out how to do that better. So.
Yeah, we've been trying to avoid public dashboards of top contributors. I mean, shaming vendors for not contributing is a tough thing, and shaming end users maybe even worse. But every end user company I talk to tons, and some companies are so backwards where they're like their lawyers even prevent folks to contribute. It's a very difficult, I think, multifaceted problem. And Sarah.
Sorry, I'm like 2 questions late. My name's Sarah Allen. I'm one of the co-chairs of SIG Security, and we've recently done some assessments of a couple of the security-focused projects, and I think looking at the CNCF projects whose job it is to do security, and looking at their best practices and evangelizing them to all the projects, I think is like a really neat place to start. And I'm really excited about like the stuff you're talking about with the end user community, and we're trying to connect with Cheryl as well on that.
From a language standpoint, like the word security or the word multi-tenancy, one of the things I've run into this week is the multi-tenancy working group using that word in a way that doesn't connote what it really means. And I'm wondering how you feel the TOC has a role or doesn't have a role in facilitating Kubernetes or all of these projects, communicating using, let's say, industry widely accepted language to signal what something means. Like multi-tenancy in this case means hierarchical namespaces, not tenant isolation. But that's not how folks that I saw in the room were interpreting it.
Naming is hard. And this happens at every conversation. I feel like every document there's some like giant amount of effort that goes into, should we use, X or Y for this term? And it's a really hard problem. I completely agree that getting more clarity around things would be better. I think it's SIG App Delivery have like a glossary they're working on. So, and I think that's a really good example of, maybe that's another thing we can ask the SIGs to help us with. Yes.
You want to go first, Brewer? I can go first. So let me go first.
Okay, go ahead.
So this particular working group, I'm involved in that as well. So there is a spectrum of options that are available for multi-tenancy, and we were trying to figure out, okay, where do you start and where can we go? And we were trying to enumerate the different things. And the first item that we said we could chew on was the hierarchical namespaces. It doesn't mean that we don't want to do tenant isolation. But so it's the context there. I have to say,
is part of defining that spectrum, one topic that did come up is terminology and what is even a tenant, and breaking down the problem into compute level isolation, network level isolation, API level isolation, storage, whatever facets can be identified that are relevant. So, terminology was certainly top of mind for that group in terms of even defining what does multi-tenancy even mean, and definitely people came from different perspectives, like people from Mesos came in thinking about resource provisioning amongst different users, and even the API server, fairness in terms of dominating request bandwidth on the API server. So it was a very multifaceted effort in terms of what are all the problems that need to be solved in order to enable use of Kubernetes in various multi-tenant contexts.
Do you feel that TOC has a role in deciding the terminology?
No.
Interesting. I think we have time for one more question. It's interesting that TOC did try to define cloud native. We do have the cloud native definition. We could have the multi.
That's more our wheelhouse.
It took us so long. That was part of the problem.
That's why we're not doing it anymore.
Okay, how much more time do we have? Just like a few minutes?
Technically, we're right on the dot, but
Okay.
let's see 3 minutes.
Okay, cool. This might go over 3 minutes, but try to go quickly. But I did want to bring this up because this is something I think about often, both from my experience at a small startup based out of Seattle that I may or may not once have worked at, and at the current employer of mine. But we talk to a lot of folks who are exploring hybrid cloud or on-premise solutions, right? And so here at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, I feel like it's very easy, speaking of the definition of cloud native, when folks say the word cloud, they think public cloud. And I think all of our tools, and this is like a small feature that spans the entire landscape, probably could benefit from being a little more like on-premise friendly and enabling folks to use these tools in non-traditional public cloud offerings where you're giving somebody a credit card and sending an HTTPS request asking for infrastructure and resources. What do y'all think?
I have opinions.
Yes, that's why I asked.
I think what we're seeing is because, we have so many people bringing so many perspectives to the CNCF, I think we are actually seeing all the counter forces to public cloud, right? 3 or 4 years ago, everybody thought that, we'd have 3 big computers, one on each continent. And now with GDPR, with data sovereignty, with edge, with all sorts of other different constraints, we're seeing these things go in different directions. I think what's exciting is that the tools that we're building here and the customers and the users and the people are participating at KubeCon actually bring that perspective to keep us honest across this stuff.
I actually don't think that most projects are public cloud focused. I mean, if you look across the landscape currently, did you have particular projects in mind? I think almost every project that we have can easily be run on-prem.
I think it's more of just like telling the story of like taking, so like for instance, like Kubernetes, installing Kubernetes, right? Like right now that's significantly more challenging doing it on-premise than it would be in a cloud provider. And I'm just wondering if we've given any thought to like enabling tools like that and making it easier.
We need people who are actually running it on-premise to contribute to those efforts. It's hard for people who don't even have an on-premise environment to help make that work.
And I would actually say that for that thing in particular, it's not cloud or off cloud, it's whether you have automatable infrastructure under your Kubernetes or not, right? If you have automatable infrastructure, it's a much more tractable problem.
Yeah, agree. I think there's language here about private clouds. I can't read the screen from here, but I was...
Yeah, it says...
I wrote all those words, I'm pretty sure. So.
It says dynamic environments such as public, private, and hybrid clouds.
Yeah. There was a lot of debate about that.
Yes. Sugu.
Oh, this is a good closing too. People always ask me, how do they get involved in TOC? How can they sit in that seat?
Join the meetings, get involved in a SIG, get experience, stand for TOC. Sorry?
Okay, I
how can they get elected to any of your seats? What's the election process like? Like, how do they nominate things like that?
It's a little bit complicated, unfortunately. We just redid it, so there's going to be a line. So it's all on GitHub. You could go read about it. But we have it. But
I read that there was no nomination stuff in there. So if I wanted to run, how can I run for one of their seats?
There is different representation. So there are essentially 11 seats. Six of them are governing board appointed by the governing board. There are 2 seats for end users. There are 2 seats that the TOC themselves selects, and then there's 1 seat for non-sandbox related project maintainers, which could potentially be, there's multiple routes, what I'm saying, so it's a little bit confusing, and I'll put it as an action item for me to do a blog post on this to make it a little bit more clear. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I personally think that the nomination process should be much more transparent. It's something that I think I've mentioned before. And I'll be completely honest, that I was nominated by a governing board company. I actually had no idea what was going on until I was elected. And I'm just being honest, right? And I think that's pretty bad. So what I would like to have happen, and I'd love all of you to support that, is that the people that the governing board are nominating should be transparent. Should be a public comment period. So I would love to see that happen. Thank you.
But even before running for TOC, although the elections are coming up, we do have a number of ways to get involved. So to be more concrete, we have a number of projects that come to the CNCF to propose themselves for donation or induction into CNCF. We do some amount of due diligence, and we have a documented set of criteria we look at for that due diligence. We always need more people who are domain experts to help with that, or even if you're not domain experts, some of the issues are, just digging in to get surface facts about the project. So that's one way that you can help out, or to, as we write more and more white papers or best practices or help explain the landscape or develop reference architectures. Those are ways to get involved. We previously had a role we called TOC participant. I don't know if we still, contributor, sorry. I don't know if that's still officially a role, but we do have, folks like Quentin who help out quite a lot with even like helping us form the concept of SIGs, and that is one way to get elected for the TOC elected seats at least. We do appreciate the valuable work that those people do.
It is, apart from the arcane nomination voting processes, it is a bureaucracy. The more you do, the more people know who you are. That's very, very important. I did not make that word up.
Let's close it out for now, but hopefully people learned something new. I think the call to action is, please check out the SIGs, and then I owe people documentation on a little bit more how the complicated process works, unfortunately. So thank you everyone for your time, and thanks.